Thank you all for coming. We're going to start with a few readings from these brilliant authors to my left, and then we're going to have a little conversation and Q&A. The first reader tonight is Victor LaValle. Victor LaValle is the author of 7 works of fiction and 1 comic book. His most recent novel, The Changeling, was named one of the 10 best books of 2017 by Time Magazine, USA Today, and the New York Public Library. The Changeling was a finalist for the 2018 Penn Stein Book of the Year Award, our largest award. Kirkus calls The Changeling a smart and naughty merger of horror, fantasy, and realism. Without further ado.
Thank you, that's very kind. So it's really good to be here reading with everyone on this panel, and I'll just dive in and read a very short chapter from The Changeling. And the only thing you need to know is the main character of the book is a guy named Apollo Kagwa. And I thought I would read the section where how he becomes a rare and used book dealer because we were in the rare book room. I thought that would be nice. All right. Apollo Kagwa might have gone to college if it wasn't for a man named Carlton Lake. Apollo was a senior at John Brown High School, and based on his grades, he qualified as absolutely average. B's and C's straight down the report card. It had been that way since 9th grade, a surprise to some of his teachers since the kid could be counted on for brains and even study, but school wasn't his true enthusiasm. All Apollo Kagwa cared about was his business. By the age of 17, he turned Improbabilia, that's the business, into a thriving concern. The kid was known in Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Rare and used book dealers learned of him because he would call a shop cold and asked if he could stop by a fellow dealer who happened to be near and wanted to make a courtesy visit. Sure, they'd say, baffled by the decorum. These guys weren't generally known for their Emily Post. And soon enough, some 15-year-old black kid clomps in. He's got a pack on his back that would make a mule buckle, and he introduces himself as Apollo. The kid's glasses are so large they should have windshield wipers. He enters their store and tries selling off weathered issues of magazines like The Connoisseur and Highlights. The combination of entrepreneurial spirit and absolute naivete was enough to make some of those old booksellers fall hard for that 15-year-old. Through them, he got the education he craved. They taught him how to value a book, how to navigate estate sales, and the best spots to set up a table at antique shows. Other booksellers were far less welcoming. When he shared his stock trying to sell, they accused him of having stolen the merchandise. Maybe he'd broken into a storefront and looted whatever he could. A few stores, the higher-end spots in Manhattan, had buzzer entry at the doors. This was the era of Bernard Goetz shooting black boys on the subway, and many white folks in the city cheering him on. Every kid with excessive melanin became a super predator, even a black boy with glasses and a backpack full of books. He might be standing at the entrance for 15 minutes while the clerks pretended not to notice him. To make things worse, Apollo would find himself wondering if he actually was frightening, a monster, the kind that would drive his own father away. That conviction flared brightest at moments like this, when the world seemed to corroborate his monstrousness. If he wasn't careful, he'd be consumed. To endure these humiliations, these supernovas of self-loathing, Apollo dreamed up a mantra, or maybe the words came to him from some old memory, one he'd repeat to himself while he stood there being judged. I am the god Apollo. I am the god Apollo. I am the god Apollo. He chanted enough that he soon felt downright divine, but that didn't mean those store owners let him in. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Next up, we have Hanna Lilith Asadi, who holds an MFA in fiction from Columbia. Her novel, Sonora, received the Rosenthal Family Foundation Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and was a finalist for the 2018 Penn Bingham Prize for debut fiction. The New Orleans Review writes, like liquid across the page, Asadi's writing is comparable to an abstract painting with no hard lines or edges, just strokes and strokes of watercolor. Hannah Lilith Asadi.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to read toward the beginning of Sonora, so I don't think there's much of a preamble I need to give you. Okay. We once walked in a land wrought for ghosts, like coyotes' silver coats marring the dark. We walked despite their weeping, unrepentant and desolate. It was only at dusk that the land was thronged by spirits, the wind and the brush, a moan, a song. My memory of it is folded into one long night, one melodic collapse into the blue-black bigness of the night sky. From the canal, we returned home, my father and I, saying nothing, through a brief and feral silence until streetlight. It was August when we first arrived, the month of monsoons. Every day, my father and I walked through the desert to and from the elementary school. In the morning, guiding us silently, were Laura and her father. Though we never spoke, it was established that we followed the path they had carved before we ever arrived. They never seemed to notice our following them. They never turned around. In stretches, my father yanked me from walking too close to jumping choya, triggered by even the breeze, resulting in an entire arm or limb smothered in spine. I never paid attention to the threat at every step. I was always watching Laura. Some nights, my father and I took drives in the taxi he called his Battlestar Galactica. One of these nights, we drove by way of a dirt road that rose up into the Superstition Mountains. On the drive, one arm out the window with a cigarette, my father spoke of other deserts where he once lived, deserts populated by gazelles, undulating dunes, guarding hidden jinn, where beyond us only stick figure saguaros stood. There's treasure here, piles and piles of gold, he said when we entered the mountains. The Arabic moon, a crescent, was a sliver on the horizon. Venus blazed below. My father grew quiet at last, humbled by his present setting, before embarking upon a new story, set in the desert in which we found ourselves, and featuring the range we soon would become stranded in. He told me of the lost Dutchman who on his deathbed had given his nurse the secret directions to a hidden gold mine in the Superstitions. Maybe we can find it, Ahlam, and when we do, everything will change, he said. A few minutes later, the engine died. The view we had had of the night sky was now blocked by a veil of mountain. The lights of Phoenix had disappeared miles back. Are we lost? I asked finally, watching my father on the hood of the Battlestar, waving for reception on his foot-length mobile phone. Go to sleep, he said. I pretended to sleep as he smoked his parliaments, finishing one and with each extinguishing bud, beginning another, surrendering only when the dust had risen so thick it covered the stars. My father jumped into the car and closed the windows. Everywhere there was thunder, the sky was torn asunder in purple, and there was the rain, thick on the windshield, thick on the steel of our Battlestar. I know that I hadn't fallen asleep when the sounds of the storm dissolved into a chorus of voices, their screaming emanating from within me instead of without. I know it was not a dream when I saw Laura. She was just outside our window, dressed in a charcoal gray cocktail dress. Mascara streamed down her face. Her hair had lost its dark luster, turned to ashen. Her body was still a girl's, but her face suddenly that of a woman. She was tied upside down from a saguaro cactus, crucified by her legs rather than her arms. She began to swing as the wind picked up, the dust rose. She was weeping, her eyes prosecuting wide. Soon you will be blind, I wanted to say. But the wind was so bellowing and the sand so swirling between us, it was difficult to tell which of the two of us needed the warning. My father shook me and I came to. He was speaking in Arabic, reading verses of the Quran over my forehead. I was covered in sweat. I feel cold, I said. It was just a dream, my father said. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Next up, we're very pleased to have Hari Kunzru. Hari Kunzru is the author of 5 novels, most recently White Tears. His work has been translated into 21 languages, and his short stories in journalism have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. Hari's White Tears has been called a moody, threatening, and profoundly dark book by the Huffington Post and was a finalist for the 2018 Penn Genestein Book of the Year Award. Thank you, Hari.
Thank you, Naji. Well, I'll keep it simple as well and read from the very beginning of this novel so I don't have to give any context at all. That summer, I'd ride my bike over the bridge, lock it up in front of one of the bars on Orchard Street and drift through the city on foot, recording. People and places, sidewalk smokers, lovers' quarrels, drug deals. I wanted to store the world and play it back just as I'd found it, without change or addition. I collected audio of thunderstorms, music coming out of cars, the subway trains rumbling underfoot. It was all reality, a quality I'd lately begun to crave, as if I were deficient in some necessary vitamin or mineral. I had a binaural set up, 2 little mics in my ears that looked like headphones, a portable recorder clipped to my belt under my shirt. It was discreet, no one ever noticed. I could roam where I liked and then ride home and listen back through Carter's $1,000 headphones. A portable recorder, Carter's $1,000 headphones at the studio. There were always phenomena I hadn't registered, pockets of sound I'd moved through without knowing. Every sound wave has a physiological effect, every vibration. I once heard a field recording of a woman singing, sitting on a porch. You could hear her foot tapping, keeping time. You could hear the creak of her rocking chair, the crickets in the trees. You could tell it was evening because of the crickets. I felt I was slipping, that if I wasn't careful, I'd lose my grip on the present and find myself back there, 70 or 80 years in the past. The rough board floor, the overhang of the roof, her voice traveling through the moist, heavy air to the diaphragm of the microphone, its sound converted into electrical energy, frozen. Then the whole process reversed, electricity moving a speaker cone, sound spilling into my ears and connecting me to that long ago time and place. I could feel it flow, that voice, inhabiting the cavities of my body, displacing the present like water filling a cistern. I heard Charlie Shaw on one of those recording walks. It was evening. I don't remember why I'd gone out. Perhaps I couldn't sleep. That happened. Perhaps I just needed to be outside or spend some time on my own. I often felt claustrophobic after long sessions. We could spend 12 hours in the studio without coming up for air. It was hot, the stifling New York heat that empties the city on July and August weekends. My shirt was clinging to my back. Passers-by were sheened in sweat, everyone desperate for the weather to break. I was recording by the chess tables in Washington Square. The guy called PJ, evidently the home favorite, was playing another man whose name I didn't catch. They'd drawn a little crowd. There was money on the table. A bottle was being passed round. PJ was one of the hustlers who sit at those tables day in, day out, playing all comers for $10 a time. He was a flabby white man in his 50s or 60s, with thick glasses and several plastic bags of nameless crap stashed under the bench. The other player was skinny and black, hard to say how old because his face was hidden under a baseball cap. He wore a clean white undershirt and baggy blue jeans. His bare arms were painfully thin, like 2 twists of fuse wire. This man was taking his time over his moves, enough for some of the onlookers to be muttering and telling him to make up his mind. He ignored them. Unlike PJ, who was chatting to his buddies, he kept his head down and seemed absorbed in the game. He was a good player. Then soon he forced PJ to give up a knight, then his queen. "There goes my rent money," said PJ to anyone who'd listen. He was stuck on the phrase, repeating it until it became a tick, each bad move. "There goes my rent money. There it goes." Something about the stranger was making the spectators nervous too. He'd reach over the table, settle his long fingers on a piece, move it, and then suddenly bring his palm slapping down on the clock. Each time he did it, an audible flinch traveled through the crowd, coughing, keys fondled in pockets. He was killing PJ, showing no mercy, and they didn't like it. "Mate in 2, said the thin man, almost under his breath. Around the board, people fell silent. PJ nodded glumly and knocked down his king with a forefinger. "Shoot," he said, "now what am I going to do?" As his friends gathered round to commiserate, the stranger counted his winnings, a wad of small bills. I was already turning away when I heard him sing. It was a blues, just a line. "Believe I buy a graveyard of my own," he sang. Then he repeated it. "Believe I buy me a graveyard of my own." On the audio, I can hear the change in the position of my head, the mics over each ear picking up a slightly different range as I swing round to listen. I don't know how to explain what happens next. My memory is clear. There was a skater, a girl. You can hear the rumble of a deck, but it's in the background. I distinctly remember turning to watch her. I saw long black hair, tattooed sleeves, a nice ass, and cutoffs weaving between dog walkers. Now, how would I know that if I hadn't turned? But the audio shows I didn't. The singer remains in the same spot. I remember that when I turned back, the game had broken up. It felt strange. It had only taken a few seconds for the girl to pass, but already the players and spectators were gone, the tables completely deserted. At the time, I didn't think too much about it. I was hungry, so I walked over to 6th Avenue to get a slice.
Kind of feel like I should pause between each one so you can really absorb these, but alas. Our final reader tonight is Nicole Sealy. She's the author of Ordinary Beast, a finalist for the 2018 Penn Open Book Award. Nicole holds an MLA in Africana Studies from the University of South Florida and an MFA in Creative Writing from New York University, and is the ED, Executive Director of Cave Canem. The Indiana Review calls her work playful, tender, and razor sharp. Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Penn, for having me. Clarice, Lily, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Just 3 poems, and then, because I don't want to be that person that goes over, so I'll just dive into.
We'll take one more if you want to give us.
Hysterical strength. When I hear news of a hitchhiker struck by lightning yet living, or a child lifting a 2-ton sedan to free his father pinned underneath, or a camper fighting off a grizzly with her bare hands until someone, a hunter perhaps, can shoot it dead, my thoughts turn to Black people, the hysterical strength we must possess to survive our very existence, which I fear many believe is and treat as itself a freak occurrence. This next poem was inspired by a work of art by Thomas Hirschhorn, and it's 8 mannequins wrapped in brown duct tape and lifted up onto a wooden structure. And the form is of my own making. The 3rd and 4th stanzas are the reverse of the 1st and 2nd, and it ends with a thesis question. It's called Candelabra with Heads. Had I not brought with me my mind, as it has been made, this thing, this brood of mannequins, cocooned and mounted on a wooden scaffold, might be 8 infants swaddled and sleeping, might be 8 fleshy fingers on one hand, might be a family tree with 8 pictured frames. Such treaties occur in the brain. Can you see them hanging? Their shadow is a crowd stripping the tree of souvenirs. Skin shrinks and splits. The bodies weep fat the color of yolk. Can you smell them burning? Their perfume climbing as wisteria would a trellis. As wisteria would a trellis burning, their perfume climbing, fat the color of yolk, can you smell them? Skin shrinks and splits, the bodies weep, is a crowd stripping the tree of souvenirs. Can you see them hanging, their shadow frames? Such treaties occur in the brain. Might be a family tree with 8 pictured, might be 8 fleshy fingers on one hand, might be 8 infants swaddled and sleeping and mounted on a wooden scaffold, this brood of mannequins, cocooned as it has been made, this thing. Had I not brought with me my mind, who can see this and not see lynchings? And my final poem is titled In Defense of Candelabra with Heads. So I wrote this poem. The last poem that I read in my chapbook, The Animal After Whom Other Animals Are Named, I extracted the last line, that thesis question, who can see this and not see lynchings, at the suggestion of editors who I adore. But in the full length, I decided to include it because I thought it necessary. So this next poem is my defense of that movement. What else do you need to know? The animal refers to the chapbook, and that's it. In defense of Candelabra with Heads. If you've read the Candelabra with Heads that appears in this collection and the one in the animal, thank you. The original, the one included here, is an example, I'm told, of a poem that can speak for itself but loses faith in its ability to do so by ending with a thesis question. Yeats said a poem should click shut like a well-made box. I don't disagree. I ask, who can see this and not see lynchings, not because I don't trust you, dear reader, or my own abilities. I ask because the imagination would have us believe, much like faith, the original candelabra lacks in things unseen. You should know that human limbs burn like branches and branches like human limbs. Only after man began hanging man from trees, then setting him on fire, which would jump from limb to branch like a bastard species of bird, did we come to know such things. 100 years from now, October 9, 2116, 8:18 p.m., when all but the lucky are good and dead, may someone happen upon the question in question. May that lucky someone be black and so far removed from the verb lynch that she be dumbfounded by its meaning. May she then call up Hirshhorn's candelabra with heads. May her imagination, not her memory, run wild.
Thank you all. I'm just going to do a quick survey of the crowd. How many of you have read one of these books before? That's a really large number. That's great. How many of you have read two of these books before? That's also a good show because I get to introduce you to a bunch of other books. That's excellent. I think there's a lot to cover today. We have 4 really brilliant books here, all very, very different. But I'm just going to sort of riff a little bit off of Nicole's last poem and the idea of a thesis question or a thesis for those of you who are not as familiar with other books or that you haven't read. And I'd just like to ask if that's something you all consider when starting these books in particular. Did you start, what was the impetus? Was there a thesis question, a thesis statement? Was there an urge? What sort of led you to the books that we're discussing today? Hari.
Might as well break the ice. I suppose I don't think you'd need to write a book if you could pose the question in a simple way or pose. I mean, I start off with a bunch of stuff that seems to need to be in the same place, and there's some feeling that I have to sift through it and that I have to sort something out. But I'm never able to, in a very coherent way, posit what the book is about or you know what question it's trying to answer until quite late on. Often it kind of surprises me and I realize that there's something at the core of it that I didn't understand 2 years previously when I started it.
For those that aren't familiar with White Tears, what did that sort of, if it were a visual map, what was it? Cultural appropriation, musical appropriation, racial history? How did those things come into the mix together for you?
I mean, it's a book that comes from quite an anxious place. I mean, I'm clearly not from here, and I came to live in the US in 2008, and I thought I knew the score, and I have my own history with questions of race and questions of identity, but that's very much in a British context, in a sort of post-imperial context, I suppose. And I thought I was quite well informed about American history, especially around slavery and subsequent events. And I realized that I hadn't got any real feeling until I came here for kind of how much it's in that history infects everything about present day America, about how none of it is, you know, the past is not it's not past at all. I can't even remember the quote that I was about to kind of launch into, but it's the past is not dead, but it's not even past yet. I can't remember how it's supposed to go.
Somebody in the audience will Google it.
Yeah, thank you. But it was, and it felt necessary for me to try and kind of to write this, to understand for myself how that past connects to the present, and how there's a sort of deliberate obfuscation of that past in the present, how so many people here are invested in suppressing the memories of what was done. And so I wanted to, and that's why it ended up, it's a ghost story. This novel is a ghost story, and in a fairly traditional way on one level, and it is about, ghost stories are always about things that were prematurely buried, that were put down in the ground before they should have been, and that forced their way back up into people's lives. And so this is a haunted place, and it's a book about haunting, and it's a book in which I sort of stumbled into the middle of a conversation that I had no business participating in, and that, I suppose, would be the other aspect of it. I mean, questions of ownership, and questions about who gets to speak, and questions about sides, and that kind of thing.
What about the rest of you?
I think, sort of speaking to what Hari said, in terms of the thesis of this book, there was a lot of people who wanted me to write about my background explicitly, which my father's a Palestinian refugee, my mother's actually an American Jew, but anyways, there's a lot of projections about me potentially having an answer to this conflict over there, but I grew up here, and what I wanted to address was the hauntedness and the crimes and the displacements that have happened on this soil. And so, sort of as a similar, I think this was Sonora was a way of sort of writing into that, to those ghosts here in America. And in the Southwest has its, the desert itself as a landscape has its ghostliness, but in an autobiographical sense, I went to a high school where there was many suicides and many overdoses, and it was sort of this epidemic that we're seeing get worse now here. And I don't know that I know why that is, but that's sort of the question I was writing into.
For me, it was a very personal thing. My wife and I have 2 kids. Our first son was born in 2011, and I remember I was practicing swaddling him, and I'd swaddled him just enough so that every part of him was in the blanket except for one arm, which was like sticking out like this, and I thought it looked very like tough, like 3-day-old baby doing a Popeye arm. And I took a picture of it, right away, and I immediately put it on Facebook. And then I would say maybe the first impulse I had was like, I can't wait to check back in 20 minutes and see how many people liked it. And this is pre-hearts and smiles, so, long ago in the past. But my first impulse was to check and see how many people had validated me as a father, because the real point of it, I understood soon after, was not that my son is so cute in itself. It's, look how great I am. I'm swaddling my child. I'm in his life. What a great man I must be. All these things are floating in there, even though I'm not necessarily aware of them. And then the second thing I was aware of was that I had posted his picture online, and I have a couple thousand friends online, and of course I don't know any of these people. And that in real life, if any stranger, if any of those people, even people who I know well, tried to hold my baby when he was a week old, I would have hit them, because I would have said, get the hell away from my kid. But somehow, through the internet, I decided you could all have him, right? And that really started to bother me, like what was that impulse in me, that vanity / love and all that stuff that made me say, I'm gonna give you my son. And then I started thinking, like, what if one of those people who is on my friend list is also a child predator? And I started taking pictures of the park that I take him to, and the school that he goes to, and all the things that he does every day. And how long would it take before that guy could just show up and take my kid, right? And so I was in an anxious state, is what I'm saying. But more importantly, I started thinking, like, if this is how I'm feeling in this moment, maybe there's something there that a lot of people are wrestling with, whether it's with their kids, loved ones, themselves. That sense of like how this gives you a chance to, like that the internet or whatever, it feels like you're opening a door, but not really. And the way that we are as human beings not, we haven't evolved to be aware of all the dangers that come with that yet. And so the book, The Changeling, is largely about that problem, particularly when it comes to then protecting the ones you love.
I wouldn't say that I have one thesis question that I pose in the book. I have, I think, several, which have to do with my obsessions: death, dying, aging, love, poets, stereotype things.
Usual.
And also one's perspective, how we can be at the same place at the same time, see the same thing, but not see the same thing. And that's what many of my poems are about. Was there a part B, part 2 to that?
There might have been, but I've already forgotten it. So
Can
it's
I ask
okay.
you something about the Thomas Hirschhorn piece?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think that that was any intention of his, what you found in that piece? Was that, or were you kind of disturbed that he'd produced that imagery maybe without thinking that that was the association? It's hard from the poem to see what your actual kind of orientation towards it as a work is.
And that was why the editors were so concerned about that last line, because they wanted it to funnel out and not funnel in. I don't know what he was thinking when he created that work of art, but he can only create from his own experience. Like, I can create from my own. And I don't think that he was preoccupied with that. But of course, being who I am, living in the time in which I live, being a black person, being a black woman, that piece spoke to me in that way because of the history of black people in this country, the history of black people, like yesterday. It spoke to me in that way. So I wasn't taken aback by my reaction. Had I had another reaction, maybe I would have been taken aback later, like, oh, I can't believe I didn't see this in this thing, given my history. And if other people don't see what I see, that's because they haven't lived my life. And I can't fault anyone for that.
Yeah, it seems, even though the various theses of your books are quite different in some ways, they're all engaging also with a kind of torquing of form, which I thought was interesting. In reviews of all of your books, the reviewers always call out to one form. I've heard it's a ghost story for several of your books, actually. Almost all of your books are called a ghost story somewhere. It's a ghost story, or it's a coming of age story, or anti-coming of age story, or it's a fairy tale, an anti-fairy tale. It's always the anti thing. It's poems that rely on form, but anti-form, anti-traditional forms. And I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about what there is in form and using form that allows you to sort of get into these sort of darker places, because every single one of your books, though often quite accessible and enjoying to read, deal with really, I didn't know what I was in for. Let me just say, Hari's book, when I lend it out to people, I just get texts in the middle of the night that are just like, holy shit, and I know exactly what page they're on. And that's because he's working with form there, and the form actually does that, and it's really interesting. And I think all of them are working with and against form here in really interesting ways. And so I find it curious that so many people are sort of returning to these forms, these tropes, these old myths to sort of break them apart right now. Maybe you want to tackle that first?
Oh, me?
Anybody? I'm not going to call on you.
I don't want to just seem like teacher's pet starting off each time, but there's something to do with.
You did bring me an apple.
There is something to do with expectation, though, isn't there? And that is something if you signal a particular kind, if you say this is the kind of thing we're in, everybody gets settled down and they have a pretty soon, he's going to bump into her and she's going to drop her stuff and they're going to pick it up together and they're going to have a moment. And you can lead people down a path with that and then swerve. And that's quite an exciting, interesting thing to do. And we're with fiction, we're in a funny moment right now, and a lot of people, have felt that they bumped up against the limits of convention in terms of narrative convention, and have headed towards a sort of writing that is, you know, semi-autobiographical or kind of dispenses with a lot of the furniture of the novel. But I've always quite enjoyed all that stuff, all the architecture and all the kind of all the mechanics of story. But I do also I enjoy what that can help you achieve. I mean, genre is something that was, you know, was rigorously policed a generation ago. I mean, you know, trying to be a literary writer and you were foolish enough to include something that smacked of genre, you would be, you know, critically mauled. But now, I think, you know, I'm people my sort of age, and I think younger have always quite naturally crossed boundaries like that. So people have, let's say, intellectual ambitions for what they want to do, but at the same time are perfectly happy taking tools from wherever they find them.
So I have a sonnet series in the book, and it's entitled Legendary. And who have seen Paris is Burning? Yes? Okay, great. So it's a sonnet series in the voices of some of the personalities from Paris is Burning, like Pepper LaBeija and Venus Extravaganza. And they're sonnets, like it's the most, what some would call heightened, you know, form in poetry. And it's in honor of these women, these voices who rarely get talked about, if ever, and whose work rarely, if ever, gets celebrated. So I thought to use a form to honor these women kind of created that anti-form, because you would never expect a sonnet to be used in that way. It's not to a beloved, the speaker isn't talking to a beloved, it's talking about race and racism, about inequity, about oppression. And so, yeah, I think it was a conscious decision to write these poems in a form that I think Western tradition that puts them in conversation with Western tradition, with poetics, Western tradition poetics.
To that end, for this book in particular, I was very consciously playing with fairy tales, but as reading about fairy tales, you know, trying to play with what we broadly say, right, is like there's the old kind of fairy tales that are the really horrifying, children die all the time, all that kind of stuff. They don't actually make any sense in any logical, plotted way. People just show up on islands, there's a harp inside the cave in the island, and then there's a dog, and the dog spits up a horn, and then and blah, blah, blah. But somehow, if the really good ones, you still can understand how or why you move through many of the steps that you do. And I was interested in that old way. And then the new form of fairy tales, right, which was with the rise of like the merchant class in Europe, where they're coming out of the rise of the merchant class. They're trying to become people who understand the manners of the wealthy and of royalty, and they have to teach their kids how to act, right? You can't act like those old ways. We have to act like these new ways so that we can fit in, because now we have money. And the way that they figured out to do that was now fairy tales would have morals, and they would teach you, always be fair, always do this, daughters never this, a lot of them. Daughters no longer do this, right? You've got to be a good girl, and blah, 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 all that stuff. But that's all because they were trying to teach their generation of children how to become middle class so that they could stay middle class, you know? And I was interested in that idea of like, how do you blend the two of those things together and then add in there just what felt like very contemporary ways of sort of teaching lessons or not teaching lessons. And what I found was kind of fun was some people are deeply invested in the fairy tales, the old style of fairy tales, the very dreamlike ones, and some other people are very invested in the very modern kind of fairy tale that is like maybe more recently like Disney cartoons and that kind of thing. And both of them are can become very upset if you don't do the thing that they are invested in. But what I found is if you don't do the thing you're invested in, they're invested in, but you give them something else, as opposed to just saying, oh, my whole project was to just not give you anything, right? Like, no, then what was the point of reading your book? But if you say instead, like, I know you expected this, but instead you're going to get this, there can be a lot of power that's almost like released in that surprise that people have. To Hari's point earlier, I guess, the surprise actually makes people become more invested in some third form of fairy tale telling, right? And that was very exciting to do.
Yeah, I think for me, the only thing I was conscious of formally or being innovative, I don't know how to say this, was the way that the structure is functioning in this book, which sort of the months keep repeating themselves over and over again as chapter titles. And that was hopefully just to reflect the way the two main characters sort of inherit this sort of generational trauma and believe that these like curses are really at work in this book. And so I just wanted to give the book a sense of like recursiveness, that time isn't moving forward, but kind of moving back. And I don't know if I achieved that. Some reviewers maybe not so. But that was the only thing that I think was like consciously deploying here as a formal tactic.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from all of you, whether you're saying it explicitly or not, is that all of these forms are in themselves a little bit political too, and that what people expect from them is based on a sort of possibly not shared, but assumed to be shared cultural memory. And it also seems like in all of your books, one of the things that you're wrestling with, exploring, is the idea of memory, both individual memory and shared memory, and who gets to have control over cultural memory or familial legacies or memories, how that is passed down, whether you believe in intergenerational pain or not, or intergenerational memory and cultural memory. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how each of your projects approaches memory and myth making. I swear I gave them the questions ahead of time. I don't know what this is. Hari's gonna not speak first.
I'm trying not to speak.
I think that's good. I think somebody else should speak first. Sorry.
Well, I'll jump in then. I have one thing that I did. I had the Apollo character has a recurring dream of his that begins as a dream, and then as the novel goes on and as he moves farther into this sort of the fairy tale logic and the idea of like unlocking truth behind truth, the dream starts to waver and becomes a memory, and then even the memory isn't quite right, and instead he has to appeal to his mother to tell him. So there's it's a dream, a recurring dream, and then it starts to become a memory, and then his mother is the one who has to tell him the truth. And I did like the idea of sort of saying that the dream in many ways was like the thing that determined a lot of the choices in his life of how he decided to become the person he would become, but that by the end of the book you would realize that he was wrong about everything in the dream, and like all his choices were based not on like a dream that he really remembered, but more like the dream he needed in order to save himself from the things that were terrible for him, and to dig at that idea that maybe sometimes even if the world doesn't give you magic, you sometimes have to make magic to save yourself, because otherwise the world will just destroy you. And that memory is often, is so unreliable that for me, it is almost always a magic trick when you ask someone like, so how did this happen? And then it's amazing, you just hear nonsense. But they're telling you the nonsense they need to save themselves again and again and again, but it's not reliable. But who cares? It's reliable in the sense that it's a story they needed.
Yeah, but so what happens when a culture makes the story they need and it's not the story that everybody needs?
I think that's every culture. Yeah.
Lucille Clifton has this poem. It's called Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes, and it goes something like this. They want me to remember their memories, but I keep on remembering mine. And I think I was definitely concerned with, preoccupied with telling my own story, my own history, the history of my people, and not really thinking about the stories that I've been taught, that I've learned, that many books have been written about. So I really wanted to be true to my own experience, thus the inclusion of that thesis question in that poem. Yeah, I think that poem by Lucille Clifton definitely inspired my writing of Ordinary Beast in that way.
It's a great poem.
I got very interested in, I mean, it's a profoundly political question of like who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. And a lot of the novel is about blues music, and specifically recorded blues from the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, I'll try and talk about this without getting horribly nerdy about it, but the kind of distance between being now remembered as a legend and being an important figure of culture and being absolutely erased and forgotten is tiny in this particular field, and it depends on various chance events, like records being found in a basement, a particular collector to putting something together, kind of digging out someone's relatives and finding out what had happened to them. Because a lot of this music was released outside the normal circuits of cultural production, and it wasn't kind of the gatekeepers in New York were not in charge of how a lot of this music, this country blues music, got onto record. There was a kind of network of scouts and. I mean, one big company that was releasing this was actually a furniture company that was mainly just in the business of selling gramophones, and was absolutely pragmatic about selling people in different regions of the country what they would want to hear on their gramophone. So they didn't care whether it was considered good or bad music, but just if the people of a particular place down in the South, they might, one place they'll sell you cowboy music, one place they'll sell you Appalachian fiddle tunes. They would just find people on the street sometimes and give them a train ticket and a $20 fee. So people would kind of find their way onto record, and other people wouldn't, who might be better, who might be considered the important person by the people who know. And this kind of strange series of events have made some people, like, names we know, like Robert Johnson or Skip James or whoever, and other people completely forgotten. And that fascinates me, that kind of the tenuousness with which memory happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess the way I sort of deal with it in the book is sort of memory as vision, right, or sort of this sort of projection into the future. So I think a lot of these characters, both the narrator and her friend, they sort of have these, instead of reflecting on the past explicitly, they have these sort of projections on the future where they keep looking for home and they keep kind of finding the same thing. And eventually that affects they're all sort of infected by this like inability to see their reality. So I don't know, I guess it's the way that memory sort of affects also the way we are able to see where we are.
I guess that's a good segue into where we are. So all of you, of course, these books have now been out for about a year or so. You wrote them many years ago. They went through a long and tortuous publication process, and now you're here in a different administration. So you all wrote these horror stories in the middle of the Obama administration in obviously never a perfect world. But now we are here, and if any of you have listened to the news all day long, it's very hard to keep it outside of the conversations, especially since so much of what all four of you deal with is myth-making, American myth-making specifically. In your own ways, some more subtle than others. And I was wondering, right now, as a writer, how do you see yourselves as part of the cultural conversation? What is the role of the writer as citizen now? And how does it feel to you in your own bodies differently than when you were writing these books? Or does it?
I think that has a lot to do with the writer's own personal obsessions. Like, one of my obsessions is just equity. And so I'm obsessed with equity, writing about it, thinking about it. The role of an artist, I'm not sure if there's an answer to that. I think the artist should do what she feels like doing at all times, being true to herself and her vision as an artist. And I think that's the most political thing to do as an artist, to live in an anti-art society, still making the art that you believe in.
I suppose you're making public utterances of one kind or another as a writer. You are speaking the truth as you see it, and one of the most powerful things about, let's say, most writers is that we're not trying to get elected. We're not trying to take charge. We're not trying to kind of wield power in any particular way, and that sort of that non-aligned position can be very powerful, because we can be, people can trust that it's one of the few kinds. I mean, of course, we are trying to persuade, but I mean, we're not trying to persuade to a particular end. It's the pleasure of persuasion. Let's say I'm digging a hole of some kind for myself here, but what I mean to say is it's hell and we're in it.
Hear, hear.
I mean, I think that I find myself sort of retreating, as I was kind of talking about earlier, into fiction that seems very sort of detached from the current horrifying reality. But even though I say that it's detached, if I actually really look at it, it has, what I can't help shake is this like incredible sense of an ending or something, of this, well, what's happening in this country and also elsewhere. And so I know there's been a lot of apocalyptic stories, and that's not exactly what I'm working on now, but I think that's where my sort of anxiety goes.
The only thing I would say to that is, so I consider myself a horror writer, but I guess I'm supposed to say a literary horror writer is what I'm supposed to say. But the thing that I take note of as a lifelong horror lover, reader of horror literature, horror films. Horror always does its best stuff under conservative administrations. It does. Reagan, Bush 1, Bush 2, and now Trump. Always, if you go back and look at all the books and movies, if you enjoy horror in any way, none of them were produced under Carter, Obama, nothing. Oh, I mean, Get Out is probably the great Obama era horror story, and it has a happy ending, right? And he switched it at the end, right?
The other ending, isn't
That's
it?
right. The other ending was so grim that he said, like, it's just too negative, because it was, I don't want to ruin anybody, but it was going to go a really bad way at the end, if you haven't seen that movie. And he said, like, the spirit of this time, it shouldn't do that. We want to see this dude survive this thing. And if that movie came out this year, it would feel like, what? That's it? His buddy? Get out of here, whatever. And I feel like, so for instance, the movie that I just saw, this movie Hereditary, right? And for whatever the movie is, right, it's a fun movie, but it is just relentlessly grim. And I mean, like, to say that the happy ending is only a few people are beheaded. Only, not all the people are beheaded, is the closest it comes to a happy ending. And I really, like, I got to the end of it, whatever I felt about it, some good, some bad, whatever, I still felt like, oh yeah, this is the right movie now, because it's super grim. And so I feel so excited about what is going to be produced now, because it's going to be so honest to this time, even more so when it's not explicitly about this time.
I love that. And on that upbeat note, can we just give a round of applause for them once more? for being so generous with their time and their words. And we have a few minutes for audience questions now. If anybody has any, there's a microphone. So there's somebody coming now.
Oh.
Or maybe not.
Question's a little broad, I apologize. Well, I think as writers and as citizens, it's very easy to fall into our bubbles. And how do you keep conscious of that and increase your perspective or step outside of yourself to ensure that you're not limiting your writing and your lives, for that matter?
I don't want to come off as like hostile or anything, but I'm very suspicious of that way of thinking because we're constantly told, oh well, we're in our bubble, coastal elites, whatever it is, and that there's this other perspective that we ought to be taking into consideration in some way. That in some way, your own experience is not enough of a is not enough of a kind of North Star. And I think one of the most useful things we can do now is a kind of gut check to say, no, this is happening. This is what I'm feeling, and what I'm feeling is valid. I don't have to double check this with somebody, 100 miles away, or I'm very worried about the both sidesism of public conversation now, which seems to drain away what I see as a completely justified rage at the situation that we're in, and so I'm digging deeper into my burrow, I suppose, is what I'm saying to you.
Anyone else? Well, we do want to celebrate, and I want you guys to have the time to purchase these books because they're really, really excellent, and you should read them fully. And they'll be around to sign, and we're also going to have a little, I believe, celebration as well. But before I let them go, just because I love knowing what other writers are reading, if you could all, if you want to, you don't have to, tell me if you're reading something that's really exciting right now or something you would recommend to somebody else for right now, even if you're not reading it.
A book of poems by Tyree Day called River Hymns. It's beautiful.
River Hymns. All right. I have not read that, so I'm going to write that.
I haven't been reading very much because I've been editing something that I'm working on, but I just read Maggie.
She just finished.
Sorry. Maggie Nelson's Bluets for the first time the other day, and it's beautiful. Old, everyone's known about it.
Not that oldie.
But I hadn't read it.
This is going to be a little bit of a cheat, but recently my wife reread Disgrace, Coetzee, and she wanted me to read it so we could talk about it together. So, and to talk about it more than anything, forget even what the story is, blah, 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 but as just a machine for getting you to read the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter, that it is an astoundingly well-built device. I don't know if that sounds too mechanical or anything like that, but if anybody who's a writer in the room, just to note, the big thing was, especially I teach writing, to note that a big thing happens in every chapter. I mean, an enormous thing, people being set on fire, someone losing their job, this kind of thing, and we were talking about it as versus ourselves when we were newer writers, and maybe some of our students when we were writing, when we're working on their book, where one big thing happens per book, and the distinction between you could probably have more happen, is all I'm saying. That was the great thing about that book.
I thought you were into literary fiction.
What's happened there? That's literary fiction.
I just finished judging a book prize. I over the last 9 months, I've read, depending on how you conceptualize read, somewhere between 80 and 110 novels in translation, some of which were good, but I am now in a kind of indulgent phase of reading weird little bits of non-fiction and genre fiction and things that I haven't been able to do for ages. So I just read, I'm not sure I would recommend it, but I just read this really strange diary kept by a Hungarian spa doctor in before the First World War. And he's 25 and he's secretly like terribly addicted to morphine and is attempting to sleep with as many of his patients as he possibly can, and is like, you see him kind of running off the rails completely. I mean, you find this.
I can't tell if you're messing with me or not.
No, he's called Geza Shath. I think I remember CZATH. Maybe somebody actually knows Hungarian and can pronounce that correctly. But that's a strange book, and not a happy book.
All right. And on that note, I turn it over to Clarice.
Good evening. This is great. Actually, I'm like, can we do a second round of like a second, suggestions? I just wanted to thank our speakers and our writers tonight. We consider you part of our pen family. You are tremendous writers, but you're also finalists of our awards that we give out every year, and we try to celebrate literature. I mean, as PEN America, we do a lot of work to defend free expression here and abroad, but we also want to celebrate the extraordinary voices that we have, and we're lucky to have you tonight with us. I feel like we were kind of brought into that living room and got a chance to kind of hear the behind the scenes of how you approach your work and what you think about it. So I think these suggestions, I was not writing it down, but we're taping and we can just like tweet them out, because I have to say these are the best recommendations for reading. But thank you, Naji, for moderating the conversation. Thank you to the Strand Book Store for hosting us every month. This is the end of our first season of Pen Out Loud. We'll be back in September, as Lily said. Thank you, Lily. Thank you to our interns who work really hard every month to bring these events together. We have wonderful book lists that we published on Medium and on pen.org. So now I think it's time to celebrate our writers, but also ourselves. I'm just going to be honest. We just wanted to celebrate the fact that we made it through season 1, and we're excited about season 2, and the Strand wants to work with us for season 2. So have a drink, buy a book, get your book signed, and see you again in September. Thank you so much.